making it here today and coming on time. We really appreciate that. We'll go ahead and honor that and get going on time here. So today we're going to be talking about 3D printing for board games, giving you the fundamentals that you need in order to get started on your own if this is something you're interested in. It's a really great way to enhance the hobby that you already know and love and are deep into. And what do you need but another hobby, right? This is a way to double up, do something interesting and techy that also supports your gaming hobby. So go ahead and introduce. Oh, come on. We had the clicker. We tested it and it worked. Sorry, Jess. Thank you. All right. So who are we? My name's Dave Intner. I've been 3D printing for a little over 7 years now, and I run an Etsy shop called Game Foundry where I have some of the accessories that I design available. I also have a lot of models I've uploaded to various sites that you can download. And Brian?
Yeah, my name is Brian Weezy. I've not been into 3D printing as long as Dave has been in. I've only been in it a couple years. But I've been in the board game world for, 20 years at this point, and, kind of did that thing where I wanted to get a 3D printer because I wanted to print a whole bunch of stuff for myself, and then kind of realized, like, oh, this is kind of pretty fun, and I want to combine 3D printing with board gaming. And so then I also started an Etsy shop as well. So that's how we kind of, well, we knew each other before that, but you gave me some advice for that, and we've been doing that together too. So yeah, so my shop is game design. So it's mostly inserts, but also some like board game upgrades and stuff.
We're both over in Ventura County. I'm in Ojai, and Brian, you're
I'm in Ventura. Yeah.
Yep. So, hey, I think it's working now. Cool. Yep. I think it was just not active. Okay. So just a little snapshot of at least a little piece of our workspaces is actually not. I've got 6 printers. I think Brian, you've got like 8.
I got 7.
7.
But
Okay.
I replaced one.
Okay.
Well, I kind of have 8 right now, but yeah.
Yeah, counting the one you're holding on to for parts, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
but this is I'm going to warn you. Once you buy one, it's like you can't. One's not enough. You're going to probably get more after that. So fair warning.
Yeah, because they do different things and they have different features and functionality and different price points. So yeah, get into it. I've got some enclosed units. Brian here, you can see he's got some. They call them bed slingers. They're kind of open air and the bed moves. We'll talk a little bit about the different equipment. But yeah, and just an interesting note in like how fast the technology upgrades and improves and the features that you can have available to you over time. The machine on the right is my newest one. I just got it like about a month ago. It costs the same, last month as the other smaller units that don't have like multiple nozzles, have smaller beds, cost 2 years ago. So the technology keeps getting better and better in terms of what's available to you at a cheaper cost, like any kind of electronic technology, right? So what we're going to cover today, we're going to cover the different types of printers, particularly the ones that are applicable to the board gaming hobby, the type of materials that you might think about printing with, what kinds of things to print, where you can get files to print from, the type of software that you'll need to interface your printer with your computer and to actually print stuff, as well as to design, if that's somewhere that you ultimately want to go. Maybe you already have some facility with a CAD program that kind of is an easy jump into making your own stuff. So, anything else?
Yeah. This is what we're going to cover, so we're good.
All right.
So the two main types of printers, at least on the consumer level, are FDM printers and resin printers. FDM are kind of probably what you've heard of the most. It's what Dave and I pretty much exclusively print. I don't have any resin printers, I'll tell you that. But these are the kind that, they got the spool of filament, and they extrude out and build essentially larger, more functional parts. The resin printers are using essentially a resin liquid, and there's a couple of different technologies about how it actually builds the part, but the kind of the main difference to know is that resin printers are fantastic at printing small, detailed parts, whereas FDM printers are really best at printing kind of medium to larger size parts. They can print small parts too pretty well, but not as well as resin printers. Resin printers are the king. Um,
You can get really phenomenal detail with the resin printers. It'll look really similar to like an injection molded plastic. The FDM printers, we got a slide that'll show you like how it makes it, but you'll end up with what are called layer lines, and they're really faint. And for most things, you barely notice it. But when you're talking about detailed models with a lot of detail, you'll start to notice that kind of striation in it. The other thing to note about filament versus resin printers is that the resin are a bit more chemical intensive, so you really need a well-ventilated area. You also might need some supplemental equipment like a curing tank and kind of figure out what to do with those chemicals. So if you're really into like role-playing games and that's the kind of like, terrain and miniatures and that's like really what you want to get in a printing board, you really might consider resin. But if you want to just do like organizers and maybe some simple tokens and that kind of thing, the FDM printer is going to be probably a lot more user-friendly and give you pretty much.
I'll add though that even an FDM filament printer with like a small nozzle, and if you're willing to be patient, it can make some pretty fantastic detailed parts itself.
Yeah.
Resin's still better, but it's gotten along. It's gotten a lot better than I know it has like 5 or 10 years ago, where it couldn't do that at that point.
Agreed. So here's a little explainer on how FDM printers work. FDM stands for fused deposition modeling, and the fused part is that what happens is that there's a spool of the plastic material that goes through a tube, and you've got these motors that kind of advance that filament, that plastic filament, and push it down through what's called a hot end. So the hot end heats up to usually 200 to 220 degrees Celsius, depending on the type of material that you're using. Some materials need higher temps, but it basically makes that plastic molten, and then that tool head follows a path that goes around a bed that it adheres to, and then it basically melts together. So you end up, if you look really closely, you can see kind of there's the lines of where that material is laid down. And that material is generally like about a half a millimeter thick. You can do smaller, you can do like a smaller, like a 0.2 nozzle you were saying. But the trade-off is you get more detail, but it increases print time because you're putting out less material at a time. So the basic parts are kind of that tube, it's a Teflon tube, goes down into a fitting, that goes into a metal tube that has a heat sink around it that dissipates the heat, so that the heat from the hot end doesn't like creep up into here and cause the filament material to melt and kind of gum up the works there. And that goes down in through the nozzle, and that gets deposited as you go on the bed platform and builds up the thing that you're building. So one of the things to know is that as you're modeling and as you're setting up the file or designing a file, you need to do it in a way that like you can't like print out into space. It has to be on top of something. So for parts with like steep overhangs or like a lot of overhanging parts, you may need to have what's called supports, and we'll talk about that a little bit when we get to slicers. But it's basically kind of building it up.
You need to know all this technical stuff to print? Not really, but it's good to know just how it works.
Right. And I will say that, it is helpful to know the technical stuff because when it doesn't work for some reason, it's helpful to know like which part of this you might be having the problem in, so that like if it's the coupling, right, you'll know to like replace that. If it's the nozzle that's clogged, you'll know.
Yeah, you kind of learn this just by doing it.
Yeah, you do.
So there's a lot of different kinds of filaments out there. However, the vast majority of them you'll never have to worry about, and really these are kind of the only ones you probably are ever going to care about. The main one by far is PLA. PLA is the one that is everywhere. It's the easy one. It's the one that's got all the colors. It's the one that just works when you print it. It's been around for a long time, and it's also basically the cheapest as well. I print pretty much only in PLA. I print other stuff and other plastics, but as far as all the stuff that I print, PLA is it because it's just easy and again it has all the colors pretty much you want, and that's pretty useful when you want to just not print everything in black. PETG is kind of the other kind of major filament. The main pros of it is that it's a little bit stronger than PLA. It has a higher kind of heat temperature. Like it won't melt as easily. Like if you leave it in the sun, for example. Like that's kind of a PLA thing. Is if you leave it in a hot car, you risk it like kind of deforming because it's even at that hot car temperature, it'll start changing shapes. PETG won't really do that. It's a little bit more difficult to print with. Not that much more difficult. It has what's like one of the things about PETG is strings, or it has a tendency to string. That's one of the issues that we'll talk about. But if you calibrate your printer right, it's not usually a big deal. ABS is great if you want like a high strength item. Like you want something that you can basically throw against the wall and not break. ABS is it. The thing about ABS though is it does require an enclosed printer because it needs a high heat to print itself. So like on my printers, most of my printers are A1s, which are open bed printers. I can't print ABS on those. But there's lots of enclosed printers out there if you were interested in doing ABS. There's absolutely no reason you need to print anything in ABS though for gaming though. It's just more for like fun stuff. And then the other one is TPU. TPU is kind of fun because it's squishy. It's pretty much everything that comes out of a printer is pretty much hard, but TPU actually can compress and squish. So depending on what you're like, for example, I make little token protectors for some games. Just like the little cardboard tokens. I use TPU to essentially make a little ring or hexagon thing that goes around it, and it kind of gives it some more tactile feel, and it protects the edges of the cardboard tokens because there's some games out there that, like the ones I make are for Andromeda's Edge, all those little moon tokens. You're using those things all the time. They tend to spill around the board, um, and but I've seen other people do it with other tokens and stuff too. Uh, yeah, it's a little bit trickier to print as well, just because it's a softer material and there's different softnesses, but it's kind of fun to print with too.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, the only one out of these that you can't print on an open bed is the ABS. ABS can even close.
I'd also note PLA is nice because it's a plant-based plastic too, so it's like ultimately biodegradable, right? It's not something that
Biodegradable-ish.
yeah. It's not gonna decompose in your game box, but if you over time, if you buried it in the
It's not
ground,
as
it would
bad
break
as
down.
other
Yeah,
plastics.
it's not as bad. Um, yeah, and then the other thing about ABS is it is a bit more caustic, so like you need to ventilate if you're gonna be
That's true. It stinks when you print it. That's another why good for the.
right ASA. Okay,
Oh yeah, yeah.
yeah. Car parts you would definitely be doing much more. Yeah.
I'll
Robust.
also add too. There's like a lot of subcategories. So
Yes.
like with PLA, there's like PLA matte because PLA a lot of plastics tend to be a little shiny when you print it, but like PLA matte's a little less shiny. You trade a little bit on the strength, but for the better looks. There's also like carbon fiber prints that no, it does not make it stronger. It actually makes it weaker, but it makes it look better. So
And then a note on the spools. So they'll usually come on spools. We've got it pictured here, cardboard spools. It's recyclable, which is great. Most, or at least a lot of them, come in plastic. But you can also get reusable spools, or you can print your own spool. That right once you
because of course you can.
because of course you can. And they sell PLA in just like refill packs that you pop it on the reusable spool and then you just pull the tabs and it's ready to go, which is a really nice way to go too. All right, so the fun stuff, like what can you do with it once you get started? There's a whole whole new world, right? It's like the Willy Wonka. Come with me and I'll show you the world of wonders. So organizers, of course, that's like what got us both into it was just the ability to get games to the table quicker. Terrain, tokens, little pieces and everything, miniatures, dice towers, uh, player dashboards, and a ton of other accessories. This example here is an organizer I made for Fantastic Factories that fits in the box. And it has a little bit of nice detail to it. All the tokens and dice fit really nice. Here's some more inserts. I'll let you talk about yours and how you kind of approach those.
I think a lot of these are just both of ours. A couple, the left ones are a couple I make. Is that one of yours? I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, these are just for me personally. That's how I got into board printing for board games. Is I wanted to make inserts for my games because there's a lot of games I still use plastic baggies for, and it works for certain games. But there are some games where it's like so much stuff in that box, like Andromeda's Edge again. That's one of mine. If you know Andromeda's Edge, there's a bunch of stuff in that box, and it's so nice to be able to just have like boxes where you can hand out to the other players, and things are just organized. That's kind of my little bit OCD needed to insert. So yeah,
boxes with lids. You can do multicolor. You can see depending on the type of printer you get. I always like to do organizers where you can basically the trays are not just storage, but they're ready to go and dispense everything and organize it neatly on the table. So that's always a good way to go. Then tokens. Here's some examples. I think a couple of the things that Brian makes for Arnak as well as SETI. I made some extra resource counters for Star Wars, the deck building game, because it just comes with those cubes, and you can put up to 18 damage on a opponent's base. And looking across the table, he's got like 17 cubes. Like, is it 17, 16? So, like that helped. And then the replacement force marker.
Quality of life stuff, or
right,
you play a game a whole bunch, things wear out.
Yeah, exactly. So, and it's just there's something that's really nice and tactile about having something clink together. Have a little bit more heft to it than just the cardboard. That.
Do you need any of this? Absolutely not. But is it fun to have? It is.
Yeah. I would argue, like, you might need this, right? Depending on the game. Just, like, if it's just you open it up and it's just a gazillion baggies, it's just like, there's no way I don't have the time or the mental energy to sort all this out, right? So, other accessories that make things fun. Here's an example of some trays I designed for Azul to kind of, like, organize the factory holders so everything is kind of nice, neat, slides into the factory floor. Thematic little walnut holders for Everdale, 3D accessories to help with plant catacombs, so you can see, like where that home base is in the center of the board. This is just an example of a player dashboard. I don't make any of these. I don't think you do either. But like that's Gloomhaven, so that instead of having all your cards and tokens and everything in front of you, you have slots that all your items and character combat cards and everything fit into. And then I also I have a game topper that you get all these different mats for it. So I have all kinds of play mats, and rather than having them in a pile or something, I designed these brackets that I kind of screw into the rafters and the studs in my garage, and I can store them on the wall really easy. You start to like think about, it'd be nice if I had this, right? And then you go out and you look on the internet like, is somebody already made something like that? And if not, like maybe you make it, right?
Yeah, one of the fun parts about having a 3D printer is once you have a 3D printer, you start going around your house and trying to find all the things. Like, if I just had something that fixes this, I can go do it. And maybe someone's already designed it, and then you don't have to design it yourself. Or sometimes, like, I can just make something real quick. But yeah, like it's very much a thing. Like you'll start finding problems you didn't know you had.
So if you're into RPGs, there's all kinds of amazing stuff that you can print out for it. Terrain, miniatures. This is a really cool dice tower that somebody designed. That, drop in the eyes of the skull. Comes out. Yeah. So you can really go down the rabbit hole pretty quick. I'm not huge into RPGs. So
Yeah, no,
I've done a lot of this myself, but it is like
none of this is ours. It's just stuff you find on the
not
internet
our design.
too.
And then beyond gaming, right? Just some examples of things like there's all kinds of like charging stands, and my favorite was this thing. It's like literally the hand from the Addams Family, right? And you can put your charging cable through it, and the watch sits on it. Um, this one here, obviously it's a desk organizer for your pens and etude route. But I had my mailbox out front was like super rickety and like just always like it seemed like it was about to fall off. So I designed a bracket to stabilize it and keep it much more stout. So that's the kind of thing, like you said, you're walking around and you find things to do. Um,
You
and
know,
that,
some people might use like wood and carpentry skills, but I don't know
right?
any of that.
Yeah, you know, you use the tool you have.
Exactly.
So all right, so maybe
Yeah. So once you get a 3D printer, you're gonna be like, okay, where do I get all the files for all the stuff I want to print and see what's out there? And so these are kind of like the major hitters. Thingiverse has been around forever. You'll definitely realize that when you go on that website because it definitely looks a little old these days and it's filled with ads. But it has a ton of files on it. It's still, I think, got the most files of any website. Printables is another big one. It's mostly free. I think Printables does have some paid stuff. I think Thingiverse is a completely free, right? Yeah.
yeah.
And then there's Cults 3D, which is one of the newer websites and kind of a mix of free and paid stuff. Maker World is the one that Bamboo Lab basically runs. I would kind of say Maker World is kind of becoming the main one these days. They have a really nice layout. It helps if you have a Bamboo Lab printer. It kind of works even better. But the files are on it. It also has a mixture of paid and free stuff. I mean, I will say most files out there on the internet are free. Um, but there are ones that are paid or there's like subscription stuff too, and they tend to be better files. I can mention that later on. But Board Game Geek actually is a decent place, especially in the board gaming world, to find files. If you go like on a game into the files section, there'll sometimes be 3D printing files in there. I know there's also geek lists that basically list out a bunch of files that people can kind of throw on the geek list. I actually saw somebody just like last month, like they developed a website that kind of scrapes the internet, all these websites, and kind of puts all the files in one website. I forget the name of it, but it's out there. I'm sorry mentioning that without the name, but
Not
I looked at
Yegi,
it
is it?
recently. It looked kind of cool.
Yegi? Because Yegi is one
No,
that will search a bunch of different sites too.
no, it's
Okay.
this guy just kind of made it, and it's like in the 3D printing forum on BGG. And then there's Etsy. So in addition to like just buying, printed files and having them shipped, there's a lot of people that also will sell digital files on Etsy as well, in the board gaming world. So another place to find files.
So one thing to note is anytime you download a file, it'll come with a license. Generally, the license is, free for personal use. There may be some restrictions on commercial use, but sometimes not. So you just want to make sure you respect the license. So sometimes they're like no derivatives, so don't like change it and redistribute it. Um, and yeah, if it's a non-commercial, then be sure you don't like go out and print a whole bunch of that model and sell
It's
that.
kind of the default.
Yeah.
Like you can pretty much always, if it's a free file, you can always use it for yourself. But most of the time, the license will say don't sell it.
And even the free sites, they also can offer like like tip the designer. So it's free, but if you really found the thing useful, you might throw a buck or something, right? Pay it forward, as they say. Ah, right.
Yeah.
So I kind of got ahead of myself.
Hit this a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah. So free versus paid. Kind of talked about that. Most things are free, but sometimes there's paid files, and like I said, generally the paid files are kind of good quality. Actually, this picture right here is of a company called Hextech, and they make a ton of stuff for BattleTech. I think other miniature games can use it too, but I've actually downloaded some of their stuff because my son's into BattleTech, and I will say their files are fantastic. Like they come out really nice, but they also are like depending on what you buy, they cost money, and they're not that cheap too. But they make great quality files, and that's one of the things. And they have a ton of stuff you can buy from them. The two main file types in the 3D printing world, I would say, are STLs and 3MFs. STLs are kind of the OG file type. It's been around forever and ever, basically before 3D printers were even a thing. They are, I would say, a relatively basic file type. They're kind of limited to kind of one object per file. They don't have any kind of extra data in them. Whereas 3MF files are kind of the new format. And in addition, it can hold more data, essentially. It can hold slicer data and settings, color data. It can hold multiple parts in a file. So like I personally basically just use 3MF files when I can. But if you go on a file site, it'll sometimes be STL. It'll sometimes be 3MF. They both work. Every slicer software out there understands both. And there's other file types. There's the object files I know too.
STL file is basically just the digital representation of the 3D geometry and not much else. The 3MF has a lot more settings that, depending on how it was set up, it might be optimized already for a particular printer. So it's very plug and play depending on the source and what you're printing it to.
Yeah, it generally is easier to work with. And yeah, if you're kind of in the same world, it works well. And then, yeah, printer compatibility. So one thing you kind of always need to consider when you're looking at files is, hey, what kind of printer do I have, and what is the thing I'm trying to print? So bed size, for example, is a big deal. There's no like standard bed size in the 3D printer world. There's a little bit of everything. But also, is there multiple colors in the print? Some printers can only print one color. Some printers can print multiple colors. There's also considerations for quality and nozzle sizes. So some prints are kind of designed to be printed with a certain kind of nozzle or even like a certain kind of filament, depending on what that is. And so generally speaking, if you kind of have a standard printer and with a standard nozzle of 0.4, that's pretty much most things you're going to print are going to be fine. And even if it's something that's kind of designed with maybe to be printed with a higher detail, you can always print it with something with less detail. It just won't maybe look quite as good. But I'd say the big thing is bed size. If something's kind of big, you won't be able to fit it on your printer unless you scale it down, and maybe not as good. Like in the cosplay world, there's a lot of helmets out there that can be printed. You kind of need a bigger printer for helmets. It won't fit on your head otherwise.
Unless you have a really tiny head. Right. All right. So I'll talk a little bit about slicer software. This is an important thing because basically you take that 3D file and you have to put it into a software. It's not a complicated software, but you do need to give the printer instructions on how to interpret that 3D object. There's different settings you can do to make the print faster, but it might sacrifice some quality. There's things you can do if you're worried that it has a really small base and it might not adhere very well, so you want to give it some extra adhesion to the base. You can do things like a brim or a raft that will kind of create a platform and give it more stick to the base. So there's a lot of things like that. Also, if you have overhanging parts that might fail because there's nothing underneath it or not enough support underneath it, you can print removable supports. There's a feature in the slicer to do that. So this is a screenshot of what a slicer would look like. You have a couple of the objects in it, and it's got like the little window of different settings that you can do. Things like infill. So the infill is like usually a print. You don't print it actually solid. So you print like the shell of it, the walls, and then the solid parts within the model will have like a crisscross pattern where part of it is void and part of it is solid, and it does it in a geometry that's still pretty strong. But depending on the use case, like that bracket I did for my mailbox, I did it solid, and it was a much longer print, but it's much stronger than if I'd done it with like 80% void, for instance. So so you'll start by importing that STL object file or 3MF file even into whatever your slicer software is. Cura is a very basic but very universal slicer software. Bamboo Lab is specific to Bamboo printers. It might be compatible with others. There's like Prusa Slicer,
others, but yeah.
Orca Slicer. I mean, there's quite a few that you might use, but I've always used Cura and Bamboo Lab for the printers I've had. You pick the printer profile, so depending if you have multiple, you have like an A2L and you have A1, A1 Mini. You need to tell it what printer you're using because then it knows what the bed size is, what the nozzle is, what all the defaults are. Make sure your nozzle matches, all that. Pick your layer heights. Again, the tighter the layer height, the smaller the layer height, the more detail you'll be able to print, but it'll take longer to print. And then you export your file. Usually it's a G-code or 3MF file, depending on what printer you're going to. And you can send it if you have like a wireless connection, right? Most modern printers have that wireless capability on board. My older printers, you had to actually put it on a little, SD card and carry it over, or like do it through a Raspberry Pi. So
I'd say the big takeaway here is slicers. There's a bunch of slicers out there. They all work really well though, and you don't have to really mess with any settings for the most part. You can just import a file and press print, and something's going to come out. But there are a lot of settings that can be tweaked and changed and modified, and some are more for looks and appearance, some are more for like saving plastic, and then some are more for like fixing problems. And as you get into 3D printing, you're going to start learning all that, but you don't need to know really any of it just to start.
there's going to be a test on this before you can leave. Actually, yeah. And you're most likely going to pick the slicer that's most common or the manufacturer standard for the printer that you get, but there are others you can use too. Right.
Yeah, so kind of mentioned it a little bit of this. So in the 3D printing world, there's definitely issues that crop up. I mean, it's a thing. So just want to point a few out. Yeah, stringing we mentioned. It's like kind of that picture in the top left where if you got like multiple objects or whatever on a print bed, sometimes as the printer head goes from one object to the next, it doesn't quite like do a good job of like closing off essentially the plastic, you know, sucking it up into the nozzle, and so it'll sort of like leave these little lines between the different objects, and this is not really a thing you see on PLA very much, but you see it like with PETG and some other filaments. You also have bed adhesion sticking issues. I'd say this is probably actually one of the biggest ones. Getting that first layer to stick onto the bed is a big deal in the 3D printing world, and there's different also bed types that you can use. Some are better for like sticking, some are better for like certain kinds of filaments. There's a lot of choices out there, and depending on what you do, but the one that comes to the printer will work pretty well. Nozzle clogs are a thing. You're literally shoving plastic through a tiny hole, and occasionally that tiny hole will get clogged with something that shouldn't be in there, or the plastic didn't melt quite right, or whatever. And so, ultimately, you probably are going to have to either try to unclog the nozzle or just get a new nozzle and stick it in. They're not that expensive. Warping's a thing. So as the plastic comes out, it comes out relatively hot, but then it's going to cool down, and just like with anything that kind of changes temperature, it's going to want to stresses build up in the plastic, and so depending on the object and the shape and how much plastic is in, things can warp, corners can bend up from sharp corners, and that is something that can happen. You can try to design around it a little bit, but it happens. And then there's also extrusion problems. There's a whole little system to get the filament off the spool, through the tubes, into the hot end, and out the end, and sometimes the little motors don't quite grab the plastic very well, or the tubes crack, or the filament itself cracks in the tubes, little issues like that. This is kind of one of those things where, once you own a 3D printer for a while, you'll probably experience all of this at least once, if not.
Not just probably.
I
want to qualify that. You will experience all of these things and more. Yeah. So the key is that, you're going to be a little bit of a detective. You're like, that didn't come out right. Why not? And then, you may be able to immediately diagnose. It's like, oh, obviously it's stringing. My, filament might be a little wet, or I didn't get it to the right temperature. I need to, it might be too hot, whatever. You'll also have situations where like, I don't know what's causing that. And you'll Google common 3D printing issues, and there are a whole host of great sites that will come up that you'll kind of like look at the pictures like, okay, mine looks like that. I'll read through what they recommend here. Yeah. And then there's also great like online forums, Facebook groups for board game 3D printing. And you put it. I have no idea why this did that.
I like to say I got my 3D printing degree from the University of YouTube. Yeah. You learn a lot of stuff from YouTube.
100%. Yeah.
There definitely are issues with resin printing. I don't do resin printing, so I just kind of know about it, but I can't really talk about it. But yeah, in the resin printing world, like you're dealing with liquid, and you're dealing with, I know there's bed adhesion issues there too. Um, yeah, they have their own set of problems. Um, and if you got into resin printing, it'll be kind of the same thing. YouTube forums, Reddit posts, super. Yeah, it's a little bit trial by fire, and it's kind of one of those things where it's kind of hard to teach someone how to fix a problem. They kind of just have to experience the problem, and once you it's kind of one of those things where like once you do it a couple times, you're like, oh, okay, I know how to fix this now.
Yeah, and going back to a point you had about that first layer being really critical. I mean, a lot of the problems that you're going to have, you'll in many cases see almost immediately like, oh, that's not sticking right, right? And if you just take the few minutes to wait while the print starts, you can avoid a lot of issues.
How many blobs of death have you had?
I have had a lot of blobs of death. Yeah. So yeah, if a 3D printer goes to print and there's nothing for it to print to, it's just printing in air, it'll just basically create this giant glob goo of filament. And if you leave that for 10, 12 hours and then let it harden around your hot end,
Yeah. I've got
That
some
becomes a
pretty impressive
fun-
blobs of death that are like this far off of the nozzle because it went for 12 hours and I wasn't around.
But some of the printers, so like the Bamboo, and I know many other, of the more advanced printers have this. They have like, like lidar detection and, other.
That only kind of works.
Yeah, but usually
I've
I'll
had the
get
settings
when
turned
this
on.
happens, it will tell you like spaghetti effects detected, and then you can like you don't even have to be home. You can pull up the Bamboo app, right? And like look on your phone and be like, oh no, it's okay. That's just a little random strand over here that just didn't get cleared, and you can hit resume, or you'd be like, oh no, stop, Dale, let's cancel print.
Yeah.
All right, I just want to talk a little bit about some of the accessories that are handy to have. Little set of flush cutters, really good for trimming filament on the spool to kind of prep it for a nice clean edge to get it to feed into your tube, or just to clean up little bits on your print, little spiky parts that might happen. Hex keys are kind of essential for doing, like maintenance when you need to take something apart to replace a nozzle or a hot end, or in the filament feeder, sometimes there's some screws there. Little plastic scraper, so usually with most print beds, once the print cools, it'll either just automatically pop off, or it might be a flex plate that you just flex it to pop it off. But sometimes you might have something that's like a really small print that stays stuck, and it's good to have like a scraper. Better to use plastic than metal, because metal can damage the surface of the print bed. And then, yeah, Mike,
Yeah, we'll say
yeah,
like
right.
Bamboo
Okay.
includes like metal scrapers, and I've never used them. I always use plastic because it's so easy to damage your beds otherwise.
Yeah. Heat gun, it helps with the stringing issue, so sometimes you might get just a little bit of stringing and there's just the slightest amount of hairs like at the corners or something, and you can just hit it with the heat gun. Also, sometimes you'll get a little discoloration on the bottom of the print if it adheres like a little too well to the print bed, and that's like a heat stress mark. And a heat gun, if you just go over it, it'll kind of get rid of the whiteness of that. A deburring tool is one of my favorites. It's got like a little curved blade, and it'll like clean up the edges really nice. These are particularly useful if you do a brim that creates a little bit of extra material at the base, and sometimes they pop right off, but usually it's nice to get a nice clean edge with that. And then if you're going to do your own designs, and it's not the best from this projector, but digital calipers, there's just a little couple of arms there that will measure like to the fraction of a millimeter, and sometimes like if you're designing for like a tiny epic game or something, and you're just trying to cram as much space in there as you can, having the digital
When you're
caliper.
trying to make something that perfectly fits inside of a box, half a millimeter matters.
Yeah, a stack of 5 of these tokens is 19.8 millimeters, so I'm going to make that 20.4 millimeters. So
and the printers are basically accurate, essentially to like point, I think 0.04 millimeters. Like typically you're kind of working with like 0.1, 0.2, but I mean they're very accurate down to like 0.1, 0.2. So you can easily do like 0.5 millimeter changes of stuff, and you'll notice it.
this will save you a lot of trial and error when you're designing components, because you print it out and be like, oh, that doesn't fit. I'll tweak it a little bit, and having a way to measure it clearly is good. So you talk about this a little.
Yeah. So once you get into 3D printing a little bit and you print a whole bunch of stuff that you like, and then you do what I did and realize, like, man, I could do a better job than that. You start going down the design rabbit hole, and so this is definitely something that is, something you may do, but you definitely don't have to do it. Um, but if you are going to do it, these are basically the pieces of software that I would recommend looking at. Tinkercad is pretty much the easiest. I should back up and say, if you want to design something, you're going to basically need some kind of CADing or sculpting software, and then that will export into, a 3D file, and that file then can be used by a slicer to be able to run a printer. So the top three are CAD pieces of software, and Blender is essentially a sculpting piece of software. But Tinkercad is very simple. It's free. I think it's web-based, I believe, and it's not very powerful, but it pretty much does most everything you're going to want to do, especially if you're basically just designing basic shapes, for inserts or whatever. Um, yeah, it's not going to overwhelm you with tools. There's a lot of resources out there that make it easy to learn. But if you want to have something a little bit more powerful going on, you got Fusion 360. It's technically a commercial piece of software, but if you use it for personal use, then you can use you can download and use it for yourself. It's industry grade in the sense of it's used by professionals to do a whole bunch of stuff. If you're using it for 3D printing design, you're probably going to use about 2% of what it can do, but it'll basically do anything you kind of want it to do in the CAD world. There's also Onshape. Onshape is web-based and free, and it's fairly powerful in itself and does really actually most of what Fusion 360 can do, and will do everything you pretty much needed to do in terms of designing stuff for board games. It's also nice because it's web-based, so even if you don't have a great computer, you can use Onshape. And then Blender, you can probably have maybe heard of. Yeah, it's like sculpting software. So if you want to do stuff that's like modeling or making interesting textures or complex shapes, Blender's kind of the place to go for that. That's also technically free for personal use. But it's also definitely the highest learning curve. It's the one that, you can make some really cool stuff in it, but it's going to be a little bit of a, got to sit there and figure things out. But, if that's kind of what you want to do, then, go for it. Again, all these things have great resources online to learn stuff, tutorials, and, I think they even include like some built-in stuff.
Question in the back. Pretty sure, yeah.
I think, I think they're all, And Onshape is like on the web. I think Tinkercad is too. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, there are other pieces of software out there. Feel free to explore them. I'd say these are kind of the most popular, but not the only ones.
Yeah, I mostly actually use SketchUp because I come from the architecture world, and it's something I already have, like 2 decades of experience with. But I don't know if they have the free version anymore. They used to have a really great, robust free version, but I think it's not really expensive, but more than you would want to pay for personal use. Yeah, that's a good tip. So if
There
you
you
have
go.
an Apple computer, run Tinkercad through Safari. Yeah, no. Yep. Sure. Yeah, we can touch on that in a little bit. We're really close to the end here, so
Yeah, we got
got
a
a few more slides. Yep.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
There.
look at that.
A little closer
Already
than I realized.
done. Hey, I didn't lie. I mean, the bottom line is like it just get every year it gets easier and easier. The printers that you have access to are much more like automated, user friendly. Provide better and better quality output. When I first got started 7 years ago, I mean, it was accessible, but there was a lot of tinkering. I had to self-level the bed, like all the printers that you're
A,
going to look at
a
now.
major reason why I've only been doing this for a couple of years. I kind of watched the 3D printing world for a long time, but I knew there was a lot of things. I'm like, I don't want to do all this tinkering to fix, bed leveling and all the issues that. But starting about 2 3 years ago, that's when the printers got to that point where they were just basically consumer printing, plug in and print, and you can just do stuff. There's still issues, but it's not like it used to be.
Yeah, you'll still
Where
need to do
you
some
had to have like
troubleshooting. You're still going to have some parts that you kind of like either order or you know that at some point I'm going to need to change the nozzle, so I'm going to have some nozzles, right? I'm going to need a couple of extra PTFE tubes, just so that when that eventually fails, I just have it ready to go. Um, yeah, 3D printing and board games go together really well. They are both complementary hobbies that suck your time and energy and like
even
crazy.
if you don't design,
Yeah.
there is so
So much.
much
Yeah.
free stuff out there that you can just go to town with and just basically pick a game in your collection and be like, I want to print an insert for that, and there's probably like 8 inserts out there available for free, and you can pick your poison on how much filament you want to buy and do that.
It's really not that expensive to get involved in anymore. You can get entry level, perfectly serviceable machines for $200-300 now, and then it just goes up from there in terms of the functionality that you want.
Yeah.
Whether you want automatic
It
filling.
only costs one deluxe Kickstarter to
So
get into 3D printing.
So look at your shelf at the all-in, still in shrink bundle, and like that could have been a 3D printer. Damn
Do I want to spend $300 on upgraded castles of Burgundy, or do I want a 3D printer?
Yep, we've all been there, right? Okay. And then it becomes a rabbit hole where like once you're into like 3D printing, like I can make so much cool stuff. Like what else is there? There's laser cutting. There's UV printers. Resin printing. Like there's just all kinds of stuff. Once you're making and you're like, okay, I get a sense of this like 3D object workflow output. Like you just start to really. Like, I don't even have time to play games anymore.
Yeah.
All right, so yeah, what additional questions do you guys have? We haven't. Yeah, in the back.
Oh, that's a good question. So I personally am completely in Bamboo Lab, and that's kind of going back to the thing where they kind of were the first company to come on the scene that really made printers that were simple, but also good quality. Like that was the other thing too, is that if you've seen something that got printed 10 years ago, the quality is like, okay, it works, but you can clearly tell it's a 3D printed thing. Whereas nowadays, you kind of can make some stuff that you're like, you have to really look at, like, oh, this is 3D printed. Like you can barely see the layer lines. It's just the quality has gotten a lot better. Bamboo Lab is, I would say at this point, they are the leader in terms of consumer level printers. I think they sell the most. But there's like, Creality, there's Ender, there's Elegoo, there's
Anycubic,
Kitty,
Snapmaker.
Yeah, there's a lot of other companies out there. It's not like Bamboo Lab is the only one, but they're kind of the king of the mountain at the moment. Doesn't mean they will be forever. And I try to stick Bamboo only just for convenience and simplicity. Really, I don't want to. Yeah, they're the ones that run Maker World, and if you have a Bamboo Lab printer and use Maker World, it's just easy. You can download the files. It already has the print profiles for Bamboo stuff.
Yeah,
I
I
have a
print a lot
mixture right now.
I print a lot with Bamboo, for sure, just for a lot of the reasons you mentioned. Plus they've got a great the refill spools, right?
Yeah,
it's really great.
they support their printers pretty well.
Yeah, but there's a ton of other brands I use. Like any of the kind of like bigger name brands are pretty reliable. So it's like, what's on sale on Prime Day? I need that particular color, right? And there's certain specialty filaments that you might get from other brands too. Like there's like triple color silk PLA, like metallic. That depending on which side of the print you look at, it's a different shiny color. There's different like glow in the dark PLA. There's UV color change PLA. PLA with little bits of wood in it, and that bamboo doesn't have a lot of those specialty ones. So I'll go to some other brands for that, and then there's certain colors
Like
that
pretty much any filament
yeah
can print on any of these printers.
yeah
It's just like all these companies also kind of tend to make their own filament too.
yeah. I like Elegoo a lot, eSun, Matter Hackers is great, but they're not the cheapest, so I haven't used them as much as I used to. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, taking that step into Etsy, most people I don't think do that. For
It's a
people,
leap. Yeah.
yeah, it's one of those things where like, do I just want to just print stuff for myself? It's a lot simpler, I will say.
There's
uh,
nothing like to suck the joy out of a hobby like monetizing that hobby. So, but having said that, I mean, the key thing is like I would say if you're thinking like, well, I'm going to download a bunch of designs from the internet and offer them for sale, I wouldn't do that. Like
yeah,
so,
don't do that.
if you've come up with you're starting to design your own stuff and you're like, I found this useful, maybe other people will too, that's probably the time you should start thinking about it. But you don't want to be just mass printing stuff that other people all have access to, because like then it's almost a
Yeah.
commodity and it's not fun.
For me, I kind of found I actually really like the design part of it, and so I downloaded some stuff, printed it out, liked it well enough, but then kind of did that thing where I could do better. And so I got into more of the design stuff and realized like, oh, I really like the design part of this too. So now I'm kind of integrating design with the actual printing with board games and kind of making that all work for me. And kind of got started with the whole thing like, well, I'll just like sell a few things and like I'll buy some filament for it and I can kind of self-sustain this hobby rather than just buying everything for myself. Um, but I would say that's like kind of the key thing is if you don't really want to do the design part, yeah, probably just stick with just designing or downloading other stuff and printing it for yourself because you could just do that and not anything else and be totally happy.
Yeah. So how's the maintenance aspect of your machines?
If you got one machine, not bad. If you got a lot of them,
Yeah. And it's definitely a lot easier than it used to be, but there's for sure like regular things you got to do. You want to make sure every now and then you clean down the bed with like some soap or alcohol or something because that'll lead to adhesion issues as your like hand oils like you accidentally touch it and that. Um, and then just figuring out like, oh, the filament's not feeding, what's going on? Oh, it's not. I didn't get the tube all the way in the coupling, or maybe like in your if you have the AMS, the material handling feeder that does multiple colors for bamboo, for instance, every now and then, like, the filament will get brittle and it'll break off a little piece in there. And so you have to take it apart and clear the tube. It's not difficult, but, you have to get comfortable with removing a couple of screws, pulling that, kind of main body of it out without pulling the wire out of the little seating. So, and there's YouTube videos to walk you through all of this, so it's not daunting, but it is, don't think of it as something where you're gonna never have to tinker with it at all, but it will be periodic.
and the printers are really designed to be maintained. Um, like all the printer companies sell spare parts for pretty much everything on that printer. I mean, some printers like Reality is kind of famous for basically using printers to print more printers. Like the printer itself is essentially 3D printed in a lot of ways. Um, but like Bamboo Lab, like you go on the website and like you could pretty much build an entire printer just out of parts because they sell everything that there is to that printer. Um, but yeah, I mean, on one hand, it's not bad. It's not. But on the other hand, you're going to run into issues. You're going to have to solve some stuff. I've had a couple of friends actually who've like bought a printer just because they wanted to buy a printer and do that, and then they ran into like a couple issues, and then they just like let the printer collect dust in the corner of their room because they just didn't want to deal with it anymore. So it's kind of one of those things where if you if you don't want to kind of deal with the maintenance issues, I mean, maybe 3D printing, leave it to somebody else. But if you're not if you're okay, taking some screws out and replacing a part once in a while, yeah, that's not that bad.
Question? So there are services that offer that. I'm not sure uh, yeah, yeah, you
Yeah.
have the maker spaces, but then you still have to run it through a slicer and run the file yourself.
There's like a company out there called Slant 3D that they do that kind of stuff. Yeah, public libraries sometimes have printers. Honestly, there's a lot of people on Etsy who will print stuff for you for a fee. You can find them too. The thing about it is like the cost for that one part's going to be quite a bit higher than if you just did it yourself. And if you have any inkling of like wanting to print more than a few things, especially with the cost of printers not being that high, it's just kind of cheaper to get your own.
in fairness, though, like not everyone has the space for it, and then they aren't silent, right? They do make some noise, so it's you don't necessarily want it in a bedroom, or at least if you do, then you're going to be limited the hours that you can use it because you're not going to want it to disturb you. So that can be one of the biggest reasons people don't get into it is I just don't physically have a place that works for it. Doesn't take up a lot of footprint, but once you get like 20 different colors filament you have to store somewhere, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it's your filament storage.
Yeah.
That's a whole thing we could talk about too,
Yeah.
especially if you want to have all the colors.
Got just a couple more minutes if there are any more questions. Yeah. 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 So you pretty much you throw them away is the short answer.
Remember that
Yeah.
recyclable-ish thing?
Yeah. Well, they are ultimately, but they will over time, like
Yeah.
a few hundred years, they will break down into their component.
But it is true they're not a plastic that is like you can put it in your recycle bin. It's
so
not that
you
kind of plastic.
there are machines where you can like crush down your failed prints. It'll like grind it up, make it pellets, and then melt it back into new filament. And there were some services that would take it back, but cost-wise, it's just not really,
Just
yeah,
try to
really high
avoid
volume.
ever having a failed print. Problem solved.
Yeah. I wish I had space for a bucket of failed prints, a museum of failed prints, right? The cautionary tales. But no, I have a trash bin. Yeah, so for the bamboo and some others, they call it poop, but it's basically just a small little pellet that preps either before every print or in the middle of prints every time it changes colors. It will, create this small little pellet, and you print enough, and like, wow, look, I've got like buckets of this stuff, right? So yeah, yeah. Yeah, but I mean, some folks get creative and they'll actually take it and they'll get silicone molds and they'll put them and melt them in like a toaster oven or something and make these cool like sculptures. And I haven't been so enterprising to do that, but
It's a thing some people do.
but for the most part, it's just trash realistically. All right, great. Well, thanks everyone. Really appreciate your attention today.
Thank you very much.
If you have any further questions, you feel free to reach out to us. Game Nest Designs on Etsy and Game Foundry on Etsy.
And we'll be here playing games the rest of the day. So if you see us, come ask questions.